It is 4:47 in the morning, and Jacob is already moving. You can hear him before you can see him, the harness brass jingling in the dark, and the soft percussion of hooves hitting packed dirt as breath rises off the mule team in small clouds that disappear before you can even track them. The sky is that particular shade of black that comes just before black starts thinking about turning blue. Every other field in this county is silent. And I don't mean quiet, I mean truly silent. The machines are out there, and you can see their shapes against the darker line of the tree breaks. Big, expensive shapes that aren't moving at all. Jacob does not look at them because he has work to do. He clicks his tongue and the team leans into the collars, and then the ground opens up behind him just like it always has. One question sits in all of that darkness, and it does not let go. Why is he the only one working? By the end of this, you will know the answer, and you will also understand why being right about something does not always feel the way you thought it would. Jacob's grandfather bought this land back in the 1960s with nothing but a two-mule team and a second-hand plow. His father eventually added a diesel tractor in 1987, but he kept the mules around, and when Jacob inherited the land and the logic behind that decision, he took it seriously enough to build the herd back up to 50 working animals. That is not a number people in this county let pass without saying something. At the co-op, they call his place the museum, though they never say it to his face because people around here are not mean-spirited. It is more of a casual dismissal you hear when someone believes the future only moves in one direction, and they have already decided which way that is. The new guys with the autonomous rigs would mention Jacob the way you mention a neighbor who still uses a flip phone, speaking fondly of him as if he were something that used to make sense. What they did not know, and what takes years of watching to actually understand, is that Jacob runs his mule operation with the same precision they use for their GPS systems. He knows all 50 animals by name, and he knows which ones pull strong in sandy soil and which ones struggle when the clay gets wet and heavy. There is a gray mare named Cora who anticipates turns before he even asks for them, reading the slope of the field through her feet before Jacob's hands have said a single thing. There is a younger mule called Prospect who can work 8 hours without losing his rhythm, but he needs 20 minutes at noon or he gets sullen about the afternoon work. Jacob knows this the way a good mechanic knows an engine, not because he read it in a manual, but because he spent the time. The equipment loan on the average farm in this county now runs past $400,000, and that number climbs every single cycle as the machines get more capable and more complicated. These machines are dependent on infrastructure the farmer does not own or control. And while Jacob watches this happen, he does not lecture anyone about it. He did say one thing once at a Farm Bureau meeting about 3 years back when someone asked him why he did not just modernize the whole operation. He told them the land has a longer memory than the people on it. And then he just went back to his coffee. People laughed politely at that. The thing about that kind of laughter is that it does not leave any room for the possibility that the man being laughed at has already thought through exactly what you have not. And the neighbors were not wrong about the machines, which is what makes this whole thing harder to sit with. The new equipment was genuinely remarkable, and you need to understand what it could do before you can understand what happened when it couldn't. Take a look at Dale Briggs, who farms about 1,800 acres just 3 miles east of Jacob's place. Dale runs 2 autonomous Tier 4 tractors, the kind of heavy iron that comes with enclosed, climate-controlled cabs and 300 horsepower under the hood. These machines use GPS autosteer so precise they can run parallel rows within 2 centimeters of each other across a quarter-mile field. And all of Dale's planting data syncs to the cloud in real time. Soil moisture, seed depth, and population rates are all logged and analyzed, appearing on his phone before he even finishes a pass. One of those machines covers between 100 and 300 acres in a single day, depending on the field conditions. And that isn't just marketing talk from a brochure. It is a real number that changes the way a man looks at his land. A 50-mule team at full stretch can only manage 10 to 20 acres in that same window of time, so the math isn't even close. And pretending otherwise would be dishonest to the reality of modern farming. Dale didn't buy into this precision agriculture because he was foolish or easily impressed by shiny things. He bought in because the system worked, resulting in higher yields and lower labor costs while reducing input waste because the machine knows to the square foot where the field needs more and where it needs less. His operation is genuinely more efficient than anything his father ever ran. And efficiency isn't a small thing when your margins are thin and the weather is unpredictable and the banknote is already due. The other farms in the county followed that same logic until the whole landscape was filled with new sprayers and planters. They used auto boom shutoff and prescription maps built from satellite imagery, while combines weighed grain on the fly and fed yield data back to a server sitting in another state. The infrastructure underneath all of it is enormous and mostly invisible, consisting of GPS satellites and cellular towers and cloud-based authorization servers that the software must check in with before a machine will even start a job. That last part is where the comfort starts to slip away. Most of these farmers don't spend their time thinking about the authorization handshake that happens in the background. It usually takes half a second and never fails, so there is no reason to worry about it during a busy day. But what it means in practice is that the tractor sitting in your barn, the one with your name on the loan, cannot do certain things without permission from a server you don't own. You are running software you can't access, maintained by a company whose priorities are not the same as yours. And that creates a distance between a man and his tools. Right-to-repair fights have been grinding through legislatures for years because of this exact situation. Farmers find themselves locked out of their own equipment by proprietary firmware, forced to call a dealer and wait 2 or 3 days for a technician with the right diagnostic laptop to come clear a simple error code. This often happens in the middle of planting season, when the window is only 10 days wide and rain is forecast for the back half of the week. The machine is fueled and the field is ready, but the software won't release the job without a handshake it can't complete because the dealer's system is backed up. That isn't a hypothetical scenario or a scary story told in the coffee shop. Farmers across the Midwest have sat in the cab of a perfectly functional machine and watched a cursor blink while their planting window bled away into the dirt. Jacob watched all of this develop over the course of a decade, as the equipment loans got bigger and the dependency chain got longer. He saw the distance between a farmer and a working knowledge of his own tools growing one software update at a time, but he didn't write letters or post about it online. He simply went out to the barn and reshod a mule, keeping his hands on the kind of work that didn't require a signal from space. When something finally broke that chain completely, it didn't just snap one link in the middle of the line. It broke every single one of them simultaneously, in the middle of the night, without a single word of warning to the men in the fields. The trouble started on a Tuesday, sometime after midnight, and nobody in the county really understood what was happening until well after sunrise. By the time people realized the world had changed, the phones had stopped working well enough for anyone to find out why. A cascading cyber attack is what the federal briefing would call it later, describing a coordinated intrusion that targeted agricultural infrastructure across 3 states. It wasn't designed to destroy the physical machines, but rather to sever the digital handshakes that allowed them to function. The GPS signals didn't actually go dark, but they went wrong through a process called spoofing, broadcasting just enough false position data that the auto-steer systems flagged the discrepancy and locked up. Cellular towers stayed physically intact but lost their connections to the networks behind them, turning every phone into a small, expensive rectangle with a full battery and no reach. The cloud authorization servers that sat quietly in the background of every precision operation went offline clean, as if someone had simply walked over and pulled the plug. The machines didn't burn, and they didn't crash into fences. They just stopped cooperating with the men who were supposed to be driving them. Dale Briggs was actually out in the field when the lights went out. He was running a nighttime pass on his east quarter because the forecast showed rain in 4 days, and he was trying to get ahead of the weather. The cab was lit up the way those modern cabs get, with screens showing field maps and seed population data scrolling on the right display, while the auto steer indicator glowed green in the corner. Then the GPS icon turned yellow, the authorization status went red, and the machine slowed itself to a stop in the middle of a row, while displaying an error code he'd never seen before. He tried to open the dealer app, but there was no connection to be found. He checked his phone and saw 1 bar of service disappear into none, leaving him alone in the dark. He sat there in a $480,000 machine with a full fuel tank and a full seed hopper, looking at 40 acres of unplanted ground, and he watched the cursor blink on a screen that was waiting for a server that no longer existed. By morning, that same scene was playing out across every farm in the county. Tractors were stopped in the middle of fields with their lights still running, burning through diesel while doing absolutely nothing. Planters were locked in the transport position because the software required an authorization ping before it would release the hydraulic sequence, and that ping had nowhere to go. Sprayers sat parked at the end of rows with full tanks and folded booms, waiting on a connectivity signal that wasn't coming back on anyone's schedule. The farmers who tried to override their systems found out exactly what the right-to-repair advocates had been shouting about for years. There was no override available without a dealer technician and a diagnostic laptop that held the right credentials. The dealers were swamped within 2 hours of sunrise, their own systems partially down and their call queues full of the same panicked message arriving from every direction at once. The specific cruelty of the timing was that it happened right in the heart of planting season. It wasn't just near the season or a few weeks early, but right in the middle of the most critical days of the year. The soil temperature was right and the moisture was right, leaving a window of maybe 8 to 12 days before the conditions shifted for the worse. Every day of delay translates directly into yield, and that isn't a symbolic loss, but a mathematical one that costs measurable bushels per acre at harvest. Across an entire county, that kind of math becomes devastating very quickly. People understood the stakes perfectly well. They stood next to their silent, expensive machines in the early morning light, and they knew exactly what the clock was doing to their livelihood. Jacob heard the news from a neighbor who drove over, because driving a truck was still a thing that worked without a server. The neighbor found him where most people found Jacob in the morning, which was in the barn working through the feeding rotation. He was moving down the row of stalls with the specific, unhurried pace of someone who has done the same task so many times it no longer requires his conscious attention. He listened to the story and asked 2 short questions about which roads were still passable for travel. Then he went right back to the feeding because the mules needed to eat before they could work, and he knew they were going to need to work very soon. There wasn't any reason to change the natural order of things just because the neighbors' screens had gone dark. The first person to ask Jacob for help directly was a woman named Ruth Castillo, a neighbor who runs 340 acres on the south end of the county while raising 3 kids under the age of 10. She drove over that same morning and stood at the barn door, and she asked him plainly whether his mules could plant her fields before the season was lost. Jacob told her the truth. But the truth was not the answer she was hoping to hear. 50 mules working in teams under good soil conditions with experienced hands on the lines can cover about 10 to 20 acres a day, and that is the honest ceiling for what they can do. Ruth's 340 acres alone would take the better part of 3 weeks at that rate, which was a problem because Ruth was not the only one asking for help. The county runs tens of thousands of planted acres in a normal season, and Jacob's team could only touch a fraction of that if everything went right, which things rarely do when you ask animals to work at the edge of their capacity day after day. He knew he couldn't save everyone before the second vehicle even pulled into his driveway. So the question was never whether he could fix the whole problem for the entire county. The real question was what he could do with the resources he had and how long he could sustain the effort. And that specific question had a different kind of math attached to it. 50 mules eat between 750 and 1,500 pounds of feed every single day, depending on their workload. But luckily, Jacob still had plenty of feed sitting in the barn. He keeps bulk bins filled every season without fail because of a habit left over from his father, who learned it from his own father during a winter that taught the lesson the hard way. Nobody had told Jacob to keep that reserve in place, but it was just the kind of preparation that looks excessive to neighbors until the day it suddenly doesn't. He sat down at his kitchen table and started making a list on a piece of notebook paper to figure out where the teams should go first. Families with young children were the priority, so Ruth's place went at the top of the page, followed by the older farms that had been in the same family for generations. For those families, losing a planting season wasn't just a financial event, it was an existential one that threatened their entire history. Then he looked for anyone who could send bodies, meaning hands willing to learn the lines and walk behind a team to do the slow physical work of farming the way it was done before the machines arrived, and made everyone forget how much of it was just human labor. This is where a different kind of community farming started to emerge, out of necessity rather than religion. There are places in this country where 80 men will show up to cut and bale hay for a neighbor in a single day, working in coordinated shifts with draft teams and shared equipment because the community decided long ago that a neighbor's crop failure is everyone's problem. Jacob had read about those operations and thought about the logistics of them, and he had filed that structure away in the back of his mind the way practical people file away things they hope they will never actually need. He needed it now. The neighbors who had been driving past his barn for years with that mild, tolerant expression were now sitting in their kitchen chairs, waiting for a phone signal to tell them what to do next. They used to see him as a museum piece or a relic who couldn't let go of the past. But now Jacob was at his table doing arithmetic on a piece of notebook paper to figure out how to turn 50 animals and whatever willing hands showed up into something that could actually matter over the next 10 days. This wasn't heroism, because that word requires a certain amount of surprise or a gap between what was expected and what was delivered. Jacob had been delivering this quietly for years, and the only thing that changed was that everyone else finally ran out of alternatives and looked over the fence. The work started the next morning before the sun came up, just like it always did. The first thing that surprises people when they see the teams in the field is the sound. They expected the harness jingling from what they'd seen in movies, but they didn't expect the way hooves read the ground differently than wheels do. There is a specific soft thud when a hoof finds a soft patch and adjusts weight before the driver has even registered anything unusual. A good mule processes terrain through its feet in real time, making constant micro-corrections that a tractor's GPS requires satellite signals and expensive software to approximate. The mule does it by feeling the earth and deciding what the earth is telling it to do next. Jacob's harnesses are built around a collar that sits across the animal's shoulders and lower neck, and inside that collar are the hames, which are two curved metal bars that distribute the pressure of the pull across the widest part of the shoulder. From the hames, traces run back along the animal's flanks to the singletree, which is a swinging crossbar that connects the traces to the implement behind. When a two-mule team leans into a load together, the singletree lets each animal pull at its own natural angle without the geometry fighting itself. The whole system is made of about 50 moving parts that any decent hardware store still stocks, and any farmer with basic mechanical aptitude can adjust or repair them on the spot without needing a software update for the first time in 200 years. The neighbors who showed up to help that first morning had mostly never held a set of driving lines in their lives, but they showed up anyway because when there is no other option, people find the option that is left. Lines are the reins for a draft team, and they communicate through tension and release rather than voice commands, though voice still matters. A slight increase in pressure on the right line asks the team to move right, while a steady, even pull asks for a stop. The animals read the difference between a confident hand and an uncertain one within about 30 seconds, and they respond accordingly because uncertain hands always get uncertain animals. Prospect was the mule who earned patience with the uncertain hands. He was the one who needed his noon break or turned sullen in the afternoons. But he had another quality Jacob never advertised. He was forgiving of beginners. A teenage kid named Owen came over with his father from Dale's farm. And even though he had clearly never been this close to a working animal, he spent the better part of the first morning just walking beside Prospect while Jacob handled the lines. By midday, Owen was holding them himself on the straight runs, doing nothing fancy but keeping steady contact and letting the mule find the row. Prospect let him do it, and that is not a small thing. Because that is a mule deciding a person is worth the patience and acting accordingly. By day 3, Owen was managing the team on his own for short stretches. The field didn't care whether he was 16 or 60, and it didn't care whether he was confident or scared. It just needed someone to keep the row straight and let the plow do its job. What the land was getting in return for the slower pace was something the county's fields hadn't seen for a long time. Draft animals at working weight exert pressure on the soil that disperses naturally through a hoof's shape and flex, which is a far cry from a loaded planting tractor at 20 tons that compresses the soil in a way that damages structure below the tillage depth. Heavy equipment collapses the pore spaces that water and roots need to survive, and fields planted this way for years develop a hard layer called a compaction pan where the roots hit it and turn sideways instead of going down. Jacob's fields don't have that problem, so his soil drains the way soil is supposed to drain and holds moisture without drowning. The neighbors walking his rows in those first few days noticed it without knowing what to call it, but they could feel that the ground was softer in the right places and felt more alive. By the time day 6 rolled around, any lingering romance about the situation had completely evaporated. Jacob's hands were a mess of cracked skin and raw knuckles from the biting morning cold and the endless friction of leather and rope, and he was surviving on 4-hour stretches of sleep because the animals needed tending before the sun came up and the logistics for the next day's work didn't just handle themselves. The neighbors who had volunteered to help were exhausted in that specific way only physical labor can manage, which isn't the dull brain fog you get from a long day at a desk, but a deep and heavy fatigue that settles into your bones when you ask your body to do more than it was ever built for. Owen was still there every single morning, and most of the others stuck it out too, but the pretense was gone. Nobody was acting like this was some noble adventure anymore, because it was just grueling work that had to be finished. What the breakdown was actually showing them, beneath all that physical exhaustion, was a problem that was much harder to name and even more difficult to fix than a few sore muscles. Men who had been farming for 20 years found they couldn't manually calibrate a planter, and that is a sentence that needs a moment of silence to really land. These were people who had spent 2 decades sitting in climate-controlled cabs while watching high-resolution screens and trusting prescription maps. But when you pulled them out of that environment and asked them to set seed depth by hand or check the disc opener pressure by feel, they were completely adrift. They weren't incompetent at their jobs, but they were lost because the fundamental knowledge of the craft had been offloaded so slowly and so comfortably that nobody had even noticed it was gone. Dale wandered over on the afternoon of the 6th day, without a specific question or a reason to be there. He just leaned against the fence line for a long time while watching the team work the far end of the field, and eventually, Jacob tied off the lines and walked over to stand beside him. Dale admitted he didn't actually know his own land anymore, and he said it quietly, the way a man confesses a secret that has been sitting heavy on his chest for a long time. The GPS told him exactly where to drive, so he followed the line, and the prescription map told him what the soil needed, so he applied the chemicals. But despite having yield maps going back 8 years, he couldn't tell you from memory which corner of his own east quarter stayed wet during a normal spring. Jacob didn't offer a lecture or a critique right away. Instead, he handed Dale a set of lines and walked him over to where Prospect was standing at rest. And he showed the man how to read the mule's ears to understand what was happening under the dirt. When Prospect's ears tilt forward, it means he's found something in the ground that deserves your attention, like a change in soil resistance or a buried rock. But when they go flat and pin back, he's uncomfortable, and you need to figure out why before you ask him for another inch of movement. Those ears are a real-time readout of exactly what the field is doing, and they work perfectly without a subscription, a satellite signal, or a server staying online in some building halfway across the country. The real question that came to the surface during those long days wasn't whether the technology itself was bad. The tractors weren't the enemy, and precision agriculture wasn't a mistake. But having total dependency without any redundancy or efficiency without a fallback plan is a dangerous way to live. When optimization becomes so complete that it leaves no room for the system to fail, you have a problem that doesn't live in the machines, but rather in the choices people made about what they no longer felt they needed to know. Jacob understood something the rest of the county was only just learning by force, which was that he wasn't trying to offer a permanent solution to modern farming. The mules were never going to replace everything the grid had taken offline, but he was offering a bridge for them to stand on while the rest of the world figured out how to get back on its feet. What a person decides to do with a bridge once they've reached the other side is a choice that belongs to them alone. The power finally came back on a Thursday morning, exactly 12 days after the world had gone dark. There wasn't a big announcement or a siren to mark the moment. One farmer checked his phone out of habit and realized he had a signal. Then another saw his tractor screen flicker to life and run through its boot sequence. And by noon, the dealer service trucks were crawling all over the county roads with diagnostic laptops open on the passenger seats. They moved from farm to clear out the error codes and restart the digital handshakes that allowed the machines to talk to their home servers again. The planting got finished eventually, though not all of it was done by Jacob's team. And the remaining window was handled the way every crisis is handled once the immediate danger passes. It was done imperfectly and at a high cost, with some corners skipped and some acres just abandoned entirely. And there were a lot of hushed conversations about how bad the yield reports were going to look when harvest rolled around in the fall. The big machines ran double shifts to make up for lost time, and the local dealers waived some of the service fees, which was a gesture the community noticed and appreciated. By the end of the third week, if you were just driving through, the county looked more or less like its old self again. But 3 specific things happened before the first snow fell that never made the local news because they weren't the kind of events that grab headlines. 3 different farmers in the county went out and bought draft animals of their own. These weren't massive operations like Jacob's because nobody had the infrastructure or the decades of experience to build that overnight. But they each bought a pair of mules and a basic harness to keep in a small paddock next to the barn. 2 of those men had never worked an animal in their lives and had to hire a trainer to help them get started, while the third had grown up on a horse farm and found that the old muscle memory came back much faster than he expected. None of them talked about the purchase much at the coffee shop because you don't usually advertise your backup plan. You just build it and keep it ready. Dale didn't sell his tractor, and it's important to say that clearly because this isn't a story about one way of life defeating another. He kept his modern equipment and even upgraded his cybersecurity protocols when his insurance company demanded it in the fall. But he also started keeping a printed soil map in a 3-ring binder on a shelf in his barn. It was a paper map he'd made himself by walking every acre and writing down what he saw with his own eyes. And even though it took him most of September to finish, he told people it was the most useful thing he'd done all year. There was a certain weight to his voice when he said it, suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with how long it had taken him to realize he needed to do it. The county extension office announced a new certification program for draft animals in November. which was the first time that kind of class had been offered in over 40 years. The wait list was completely full within a single week, and that wasn't just a symbolic gesture, but rather the result of people doing a very specific kind of math in their heads. They had reached a conclusion about what a reasonable fallback looks like when you realize just how dependent you are on a system you don't control. When the Farm Bureau held its winter meeting, they asked Jacob to come and speak to the group. He sat at the front table for 40 minutes and listened to everyone talk about federal infrastructure, cybersecurity standards, and the new right-to-repair laws that were finally moving through the state legislature. When it was finally his turn, he only spoke for about 3 minutes, focusing on the practicalities of feed storage and the cost of keeping a team healthy through the winter. He reminded them that the knowledge of how to work these animals lives in a person's hands rather than on a screen, which means it has to be practiced every day or it simply disappears. He had brought Prospect with him, and the mule stood tied near the parking lot entrance while the cold wind blew, looking completely unbothered by the weather. People stopped to look at the animal on their way in and out of the building, and Owen, Dale's boy, stood there for a long time with his hand on the mule's neck without saying a single word. Nobody in that room actually believed that mules were going to replace their high-tech machinery. That wasn't the point Jacob was making, and everyone there understood it without him having to say it out loud. The point was that the grid is going to go down again someday, and the question of what you have ready for that moment is something you should probably answer before the lights go out, rather than while you're sitting in the dark. Jacob didn't stick around to hear a verdict on his speech. He just loaded Prospect back into the trailer, drove home in the dark, and went to bed. The barn looks the same at dusk as it did before any of this happened, with 50 mules eating and hooves shifting on the straw. You can hear the slow, mechanical sound of an animal working through a bucket of grain while the neighbors' cab screens glow in the early dark. Out past the fence line, those machines sit with their software updated and servers responding, just waiting to run first thing tomorrow morning. Jacob didn't win an argument, because that debate is still going on in the legislature and the insurance offices right now. You find it in every farm kitchen where someone sits with a loan statement trying to figure out what next year looks like for their family. He simply kept his barn full and his animals worked. And when the county needed a bridge, he had one ready to go. Whether anyone builds something more permanent on the other side of that water is a question that stays open for now. If that's worth sitting with, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one here, and the truth is, they don't get any simpler the further in you go.